Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times. So stick around. So if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 51, which is the first time that Amalickiah leads his armies to attack the Nephites. And so it's a very serious threat approaching the Nephites, and at the same time, there's some internal conflict that's happening with some kingmen and some freemen that the government is kind of having to figure out. And while all that's happening, the Lamanites continue to get closer and closer to Zarahemla, the capital city, and they're capturing city after city after city. And yeah, things are going super great. But then, luckily, the hero of the day, Teancum's army, comes in, is able to cut off the army of Amalickiah finally after their long rampage, and eventually, Teancum himself murders Amalickiah in his tent while he sleeps. It is freaking awesome. So go back, listen to that episode if you have not already. But yeah, I think without further ado, let's move on to Alma chapter 52. And now it came to pass in the 26th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi, behold, when the Lamanites awoke on the first morning of the first month, behold, they found Amalickiah was dead in his own tent, and they also saw that Teancum was ready to give them battle on that day. And now, when the Lamanites saw this, they were affrighted, and they abandoned their design in marching into the land northward, and retreated with all their army into the city of Mulek, and sought protection in their fortifications. And it came to pass that the brother of Amalickiah was appointed king over the people, and his name was Ammoron. Thus King Ammoron, the brother of King Amalickiah, was appointed to reign in his stead. So now that Amalickiah is dead, and now that people know that Amalickiah is dead, his brother is now king of the Lamanites. Somehow I doubt that Ammoron is going to be a much better, more peaceful king than Amalickiah was, because something should tell you about the fact that he was poised to succeed Amalickiah in the event that he should die. Amalickiah had no time to say a last will or testament as Teancum chucked a javelin into his chest in the middle of the night. And so clearly, Ammoron was ready. So either he was already chosen to succeed Amalickiah by Amalickiah, which, if Amalickiah likes you, that should really tell you something about your character, or he was power-hungry enough to wrench power as soon as the power vacuum became obvious, which also tells you something about his character. So either way, this new king of the Lamanites is probably not going to be that much better than Amalickiah himself. So yeah, let's kind of brace ourselves to see how Ammoron is, and how he's different from his brother, if at all. And it came to pass that he did command that his people should maintain those cities which they had taken by the shedding of blood, for they had not taken any cities save they had lost much blood. And now Teancum saw that the Lamanites were determined to maintain those cities which they had taken, and those parts of the land which they had obtained possession of. And also seeing the enormity of their number, Teancum thought it was not expedient that he should attempt to attack them in their forts. But he kept his men round about, as if making preparations for war, yea, and truly he was preparing to defend himself against them, by casting up walls round about, and preparing places of resort. And it came to pass that he kept thus preparing for war, until Moroni had sent a large number of men to strengthen his army. And Moroni also sent orders unto him that he should retain all the prisoners who fell into his hands, for as the Lamanites had taken many prisoners, that he should retain all the prisoners of the Lamanites as a ransom for those whom the Lamanites had taken. And he also sent orders unto him that he should fortify the land bountiful, and secure the narrow pass which led into the land northward, lest the Lamanites should obtain that point and should have power to harass them on every side. So Teancum kind of has a tall order right now, because his army is still kind of chilling out near the army of Amalickiah. No other army was able to head them the way that Teancum's did, and so they're still kind of there. Kind of on the scene of the crime. This is kind of very much a continuation of last chapter. And now Captain Moroni is beefing up his army by sending more people. He's having him set up fortifications to help him have forts to hang out in, just like the Lamanites do in the cities that they captured. And also he wants him to defend specifically the narrow neck of land between the land southward and the land northward, because if the Lamanites get that narrow neck of land, that will be very, very strategically bad for them. And so now Teancum kind of has all of this going on. He's suddenly a very, very important general, if he wasn't already. And now he basically has the entire war on his shoulders. So hopefully more people come to help him, more armies. Obviously his army is getting replenished with more soldiers, but it's still just him out there. So anyways, I'm feeling a little bit bad for Teancum because he's got to been chucked into the fire. But anyways, I'm sure that he's handling it well. He is, of course, the original American Ninja Warrior, so I'm sure that he's fine. But still, you don't really hear that much of Tiancum before this chapter. You hear of him one other time, and now he's kind of the center of attention because his army was the one that was able to actually stop Amalickiah's army. And Moroni also sent unto him, desiring him that he would be faithful in maintaining that quarter of the land, and that he would seek every opportunity to scourge the Lamanites in that quarter as much as was in his power, that perhaps he might take again by stratagem or some other way those cities which had been taken out of their hands, and that he also would fortify and strengthen the cities round about, which had not fallen into the hands of the Lamanites. And he also said unto him, I would come unto you, but behold, the Lamanites are upon us in the borders of the land by the west sea, and behold, I go against them, therefore I cannot come unto you. Now the king, Ammoron, had departed out of the land of Zarahemla, and had made known unto the queen concerning the death of his brother, and had gathered together a large number of men, and had marched forth against the Nephites on the borders by the west sea. So it's actually very interesting. So there are obviously Lamanites still occupying the cities that Amalickiah's army did in fact get, but now there is kind of a separate army, it seems. Or maybe Amalickiah's original army moved, because now they're attacking on the West Sea as led by Ammoron. And interestingly, it says in verse 12 that the king, Ammoron, had departed out of the land of Zarahemla. And so, was Amalickiah's own brother living as a Nephite in Zarahemla while he was poised to succeed Amalickiah as king of the Lamanites himself? Or was he just in or near Zarahemla as part of the war effort? That is something that I'm not sure about. But anyways, that's just kind of something that I noticed, and that is why they went from attacking on the east seashore, which is where Amalickiah came from, and attacked all those cities, like the city of Lehi and Morianton and all that, to now they're being attacked on the west side. So Tiancum is kind of trying to take back some of the cities on the east, and now Captain Moroni himself is helping lead the armies to defend the Nephites on the west. So now they're kind of getting attacked on two fronts, some from occupied cities, and the other from an army attacking on the west. And so it's actually kind of really sweet how Captain Moroni specifically says, I would come help you if I could, but I can't. He's like, I want to help you out. I want to be able to support you in this effort. But gosh, I cannot right now because I'm literally fighting people. Like, I wish I could help you. I just think that's kind of sweet. And thus he was endeavoring to harass the Nephites and to draw away a part of their forces to that part of the land, while he had commanded those whom he had left to possess the cities which he had taken, that they should also harass the Nephites on the borders by the east sea, and should take possession of their lands as much as it was in their power, according to the power of their armies. And thus it were the Nephites in those dangerous circumstances in the ending of the 26th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi. But behold, it came to pass in the 27th year of the reign of the judges that Tiancum, by the command of Moroni, who had established armies to protect the south and the west borders of the land, had begun his march towards the land Bountiful, that he might assist Tiancum with his men in retaking the cities which they had lost. And it came to pass that Tiancum had received orders to make an attack upon the city of Mulek and retake it if it were possible. And it came to pass that Tiancum made preparations to make an attack upon the city of Mulek, and march forth with his army against the Lamanites. But he saw that it was impossible that he could overpower them while they were in their fortifications. Therefore, he abandoned his designs, and returned again to the city Bountiful, to wait for the coming of Moroni, that he might receive strength to his army. So now the Nephites are properly flanked, because Ammoron is attacking on the west, and the possessing forces in the cities that the Lamanites took are attacking from the east. And so now the armies of the Nephites are split. But once Captain Moroni settles the armies in the western front and kind of gets all that organized under different generals, he is able to lead his own army to actually now and go and support Tiancum. Because remember I mentioned earlier how Captain Moroni was like, oh gosh, I wish I could come help you. Now he is. He's fulfilling his promise. He's bringing people to replenish his army. And what's interesting is the fact that Tiancum was ordered to try and take back the city of Mulek, but he looked at it once and he was like, this is not going to happen. Like, there's no way. They're so well fortified. They're holed up in that city with walls and pickets and towers and ditches. It's just not going to happen. And so now he's just waiting for Moroni to come so they can maybe re-strategize. And what I sense approaching is kind of an allegory of sorts on a different scale than what we've seen before. So far, we've kind of seen the Satan figure and righteous man figure represented by entire armies. Like the Lamanite army is Satan's army, and the Nephite army is kind of the people of God trying to avoid temptation, right? But now we're going to see that the Lamanites in their fortified city is a righteous man figure, and the Nephites are going to try and tempt them out of their stronghold, out of their fortifications, so that they can attack them, because there is no way they're getting into that city otherwise. And so pay very close attention to how things continue to go, because we're going to see the Nephites this time using quote-unquote satanic tactics to lure out the Lamanites from their stronghold. If you remember the Lehantai principle, Lehantai was very safe at the very top of his hill, and it was only when he descended from his hill that he was put in danger. It's the same principle, except instead of a hill, it's a walled city. So as soon as you leave your walled city, you are vulnerable. You know, that's kind of the vibe here, so look out for stuff like that. And it came to pass that Moroni did arrive with his army at the land of Bountiful in the latter end of the 27th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi. And in the commencement of the 28th year, Moroni and Teancum and many of the chief captains held a council of war, what they should do to cause the Lamanites to come out against them to battle, or that they might by some means flatter them out of their strongholds, that they might gain advantage over them and take again the city of Mulek. And it came to pass that they sent embassies to the army of the Lamanites, which protected the city of Mulek, to their leader, whose name was Jacob, desiring him that he would come out with his armies to meet them upon the plains between the two cities. But behold, Jacob, who was a Zoramite, would not come out with his army to meet them upon the plains. So, just like I said, now the chief captains of the Nephites and Captain Moroni and Teancum are all kind of counseling together to try and, as it says in verse 19, flatter them out of their strongholds. Is the word flatter not so Satan figure-y? You know? Like, I feel like all the antichrists, all the false prophets that show up in the Book of Mormon, like Korhor and Nehor, always are described using the word flattery. And now, that's what the Nephites are doing. So again, look out for what the Nephites do and the mistakes that the Lamanites make as they get tricked by the Nephites. And so it's actually kind of hilarious. Their first attempt to get the Lamanites out of the stronghold is just to ask them to meet outside of the city. Like in verse 20, it literally just says, they sent someone to go ask the Lamanites if they would meet in a field. Yeah, that's a very, very subtle ploy. Maybe they'll fall for it. But hey, I mean, I guess it was worth trying, you know? Anyways, it's just kind of a funny first attempt. But yeah, let's continue to see how this kind of develops and how, I'm sure the Nephites eventually will, get advantage over the Lamanites. And it came to pass that Moroni, having no hopes of meeting them upon fair grounds, therefore, he resolved upon a plan that he might decoy the Lamanites out of their strongholds. Therefore, he caused that Teancum should take a small number of men and march down near the seashore. And Moroni and his army by the night marched in the wilderness on the west of the city Mulek. And thus on the morrow, when the guards of the Lamanites had discovered Teancum, they ran and told it unto Jacob their leader. And it came to pass that the armies of the Lamanites did march forth against Teancum, supposing by their numbers to overpower Teancum because of the smallness of his numbers. And as Teancum saw the armies of the Lamanites coming out against him, he began to retreat down by the seashore northward. And it came to pass that when the Lamanites saw that he began to flee, they took courage and pursued them with vigor. And while Teancum was thus leading away the Lamanites, who were pursuing them in vain, behold, Moroni commanded that a part of his army who were with him should march forth into the city and take possession of it. And thus they did, and slew all those who had been left to protect the city, yea, all those who would not yield up their weapons of war. And thus Moroni had obtained possession of the city Mulek with a part of his army, while he marched with the remainder to meet the Lamanites when they should return from the pursuit of Teancum. So, in such few verses, the Nephites already have the city of Mulek back. And how do they do it? As it says in verse 21, they decoyed the Lamanites out of their stronghold. So basically a small group of Teancum's army, not his entire army, but part of it, kind of ran past the city, right? And then the Lamanites saw, hey look, let's chase them away, let's kill them, whatever. And so they leave their city and attack and chase the tiny little group that Teancum's leading. And by doing so, they leave their own city insufficiently defended. So much so that a part of Moroni's army is able to come in and take over the city, while the large majority of the army is still chasing Teancum's group. And so again, we're looking for mistakes here. We're looking for mistakes that the Lamanites made that we as people can avoid making in our lives when it comes to defending against Satan. The first mistake that they did is the cardinal mistake. They left their stronghold. Period. They saw easy pickings right outside their door, and they were like, that's nothing. We can handle that. This is fine. And so they left with most of their army, only leaving a little bit to defend the city, and chased after this tiny little army. That seemed like easy pickings. It seemed like it was nothing. But they stepped outside of their walls. And that is why they lost the city. No other reason. There's not too many secrets when it comes to defending against Satan. There's just some broad principles, and one of those cardinal principles, one of the foundational principles, is do not leave your fortifications. You have all these walls set up, you have these towers, you have these pickets and ditches, and you're protected. You're ready. You're defending yourself in so many different ways. But the moment that you step out of that is the moment you're vulnerable. And so you might be living in a way that you don't do alcohol, you don't do drugs, you keep certain standards that the church asks you to keep, and you've kind of built your life around living this way. And so you're protected by habit mostly, just by, well, I haven't been drinking and so I'm going to continue not to drink. That's a very strong defense. But as soon as you make an exception, as soon as you leave that safety that you have in the choices that you've made, in the covenants that you've made, then you are more vulnerable. Anyways, very interesting, and I think it's kind of fun when the role of Satan switches to the Nephites, Like, usually, you'd think that it was the Lamanites that are bad, the Nephites that are good, and, that remains true, like the Nephites are still believers in God, but the tactics that they're using are kind of inspired by Satan. Isn't that kind of cool? I love it when they switch like that. Anyways, so much fun. And it came to pass that the Lamanites did pursue Teancum until they came near the city Bountiful. And then they were met by Lehi and a small army, which had been left to protect the city Bountiful. And now behold, when the chief captains of the Lamanites had beheld Lehi with his army coming against them, they fled in much confusion, lest perhaps they should not obtain the city Mulek before Lehi should overtake them, for they were wearied because of their march, and the men of Lehi were fresh. Now the Lamanites did not know that Moroni had been in their rear with his army, and all they feared was Lehi and his men. Now Lehi was not desirous to overtake them till they should meet Moroni and his army. And it came to pass that before the Lamanites had retreated far, they were surrounded by the Nephites, by the men of Moroni on one hand, and the men of Lehi on the other, all of whom were fresh and full of strength, but the Lamanites were wearied because of their long march. And Moroni commanded his men that they should fall upon them until they had given up their weapons of war. And it came to pass that Jacob, being their leader, being also a Zoramite, and having an unconquerable spirit, he led the Lamanites forth to battle with exceeding fury against Moroni. So, here the Lamanites make yet another mistake. They're already presumably miles away from their city, still chasing after Teancum, and they run into the fresh army of Lehi. And they obviously get chased. They run back to their city thinking, oh my goodness, what if these fresh soldiers beat us to our own city? And they're distracted by Lehi, thinking that Lehi's army is the only threat, not knowing that they are already screwed. Not knowing that the moment that they left and were out of sight of their fortifications, it was immediately taken over by Moroni. They think that the only army threatening them is that of Lehi. They're only thinking about the threats that they can see. But there is this entire other threat that they're not even considering that they can't see. And so when it comes to defending ourselves, we need to remember that there are threats that we can't see or don't think about. And so when it comes to defending ourselves against the temptations of Satan or what have you, there are threats that we can't see. Even though we think that we can see everything, we think we understand everything, we think we know the risks, we don't. There are invisible risks that we cannot understand until it's already too late. So anyways, I just think it's kind of interesting that Lehi is kind of the visible threat. And that is why in verse 29 it says, all they feared was Lehi and his men. That's when they kind of started to run back to their city, afraid that the army of Lehi would beat them. But again, like I said, little did they know, they did not only have to fear Lehi. They actually had to fear much more, and they don't even understand yet the length and breadth of how screwed they are. Anyways, I love this aspect of the story as well, because not only did they leave their fortifications, but they were misled in how threatened they felt. Because up to the point that they ran into the army of Lehi, they felt safe. They assumed their city back miles behind them was still fine, still under the protection of the people that they left to protect it. and they thought that one army that they ran into was the real problem. But again, it wasn't. So anyways, a very, very interesting lesson to keep from this. Moroni being in their course of march, therefore Jacob was determined to slay them and cut his way through to the city of Mulek. But behold, Moroni and his men were more powerful, therefore they did not give way before the Lamanites. And it came to pass that they fought on both hands with exceeding fury, and there were many slain on both sides, yea, and Moroni was wounded, and Jacob was killed. And Lehi pressed upon their rear with such fury with his strong men that the Lamanites in the rear delivered up their weapons of war, and the remainder of them, being much confused, knew not whither to go or to strike. Now Moroni, seeing their confusion, he said unto them, If ye will bring forth your weapons of war and deliver them up, behold, we will forbear shedding your blood. And it came to pass that when the Lamanites had heard these words, their chief captains, all those who were not slain, came forth and threw down their weapons of war at the feet of Moroni, and also commanded their men that they should do the same. But behold, there were many that would not, and those who would not deliver up their swords were taken and bound, and their weapons of war were taken from them, and they were compelled to march with their brethren forth into the land bountiful. And now the number of prisoners who were taken exceeded more than the number of those who had been slain, yea, more than those who had been slain on both sides. So, the Nephites have a lot of prisoners, but what I love about the ending of this chapter, this kind of final fight that ends in the Lamanite army that is possessing the land of Mulek to be completely either killed or taken prisoner. That fight itself, I think, is also very important. So I already talked a little bit about how the army of Lehi was the only perceived threat to the people of Mulek. But not only did Moroni send a part of his army to possess the city, he also sent another part of his army down to kind of chase the Lamanites and face them once the Lamanites turned back to return to their city. And so what I think is significant about this is that the Lamanites never learned that their city was taken. They never got back to their city at all. It doesn't even seem like they got close enough to their city to see it. They only know that they left their stronghold, they chased a tiny little army that seemed like no threat, they found another Nephite army, and they had to turn back to their city to be like, oh no, what if they beat us to it? And then they end up getting flanked, and they get stuck out in the wilderness between cities, and they never get back to their home city ever again. I'm sure in their mind, they were just like, oh, we'll chase away or kill this tiny little army, and then we'll come back and it'll be fine. But they ended up getting decoyed away farther and farther and farther, and finally, in the end, they were flanked on both sides by people stronger than them. Which I think that there's a little bit of intentional parallelism in this chapter, because again, like I mentioned, the chapter starts with the Lamanite army flanking the Nephites, where Ammoron takes the armies that Amalickiah had and attacks from the west, while the armies that were already possessing cities that they had already taken were on the east. And so the Nephites were getting attacked from the west and from the east. And now finally, in the end of this chapter, this Lamanite army that had been possessing the city of Mulek was flanked on one side by Moroni and on the other side by Lehi. There's a little bit of parallelism here, do you not see that? Anyways, what an interesting chapter. There is so much to dig into with how to apply this to our lives. I've already gone into great detail, but I encourage you to read this on your own and to kind of think certain ways that it applies to your life specifically. Specific temptations that you struggle with, specific things that might even tempt you to leave your fortifications, maybe even specific defenses that you can put up to stop yourself from leaving your fortifications in the first place. Also, maybe even consider, what are your fortifications? What are your defenses against certain temptations? How are you making sure that you don't only have one defense against things, but multiple levels of it, as we've mentioned in previous chapters? So yeah, very important stuff to think about when it comes to learning how to remain a disciple of Christ. So the standout verse for this chapter is going to be verse 29, which says, Now the Lamanites did not know that Moroni had been in their rear with his army, and all they feared was Lehi and his men. So I've already talked a little bit about why this verse is so compelling to me, because it shows me that they only see one threat, when in reality, the threats were actually a lot more present than they had ever imagined. And also, they already won. They already took back the city that in this verse, the Lamanites are afraid the army of Lehi will take back. So, it really goes to show that there are much deeper, more secret threats than the ones that you see. They were far enough away from their city, they didn't even see their entire city get possessed behind them as they chased this tiny little army away. And like I said in the end, they never even got back to Mulek to see that it was possessed. I'm sure that they learned eventually through the grapevine of the Nephites that are now their prison holders, but they never got back. They didn't, chase the army of Teancum and then get chased back by Lehi and then get back in their city and they're safe. That did not happen. Because once Satan gets you out of your fortifications, he will ensure that you never get back by any means necessary. And so I think there's definitely lessons to be learned here. And I've already mentioned questions that you should ask yourself. But yeah, this chapter can really apply to us personally. This is why I love the war chapters, because it's so applicable. So yeah, that's the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed. This is such a cool chapter. Like, I've already talked about it, but oh my goodness, it's so applicable. It's so cool. What a fun chapter. I mean, I guess we'll see in the next chapters how Amram is as a king of the Lamanites, because Malachiah has been killed. Ah! So anyways, I guess we'll see how that goes. But yeah, there's just a few links down in the show notes that I want to quickly point out. The first one is a let me know what you learned link, so if you want to shoot me a message and chat about something Book of Mormon related, you can do that there, or you can DM me on Instagram, which will probably be quicker, realistically. Next, there are a handful of links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon, so if you don't have your own copy and you want to read along to the podcast, that's an option for you. Next, there's a quick support the show link, so if you really like what I'm doing and you want to support me, that's a way to do it, and it'd be greatly appreciated. Next, we're on YouTube, so if you want to access the podcast on that platform, you can go ahead and do that. You can also find some YouTube shorts that I've been publishing there recently. And yeah, all in all, it's a good time, so subscribe there. And finally, if you want to find me on the place that I tend to be the most active, that would be Instagram. So that's the bottom link down in the show notes. You can go ahead and follow me there if you want to find episode clips, you want to find my reels, you want to find some trivia, and story updates. So yeah, good times had by all. But yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.